Warrenke System, Federated Suns, Warrenke III, Talon, Moon, March 3rd, 2772. Callan Industries, Engineering Building 12.
What are we doing here? We're going around in circles on this.
You know, they say it's difficult to improve upon perfection.
Yeah, we know you're a rifleman fanboy, but I think we can do better.
Can we?
If you want, you could transfer over to the partisan design team.
What were you saying about taking another look at those Model C medium autocannons?
Yeah, that's what I thought. Let's get back to work.
Iterative design is a concept that many seem to struggle with because very often the process can present as continual failure. Though it's ubiquitous across engineering, the best or possibly the most dramatic demonstration of iterative design is with rocketry. It makes a good example for two reasons. The first is one of the most common consequences of trial and error and testing tolerances of your design is a gigantic fireball and wreckage plummeting back to Earth. The second reason is the expense involved in building an incredibly complex machine with tens or hundreds of thousands of parts that need to work together, or else you get that fireball I previously referenced. In the case of the often maligned Jagermech, designers at Callan were challenged to take a wildly successful 60-ton rifleman and iterate upon it. As great as the rifleman was, it of course did have its faults. The 3N available in 2770 was notoriously a hotbox, with its twin AC-5 autocannons that could only fire 10 times apiece before having to flee back for resupply. It was also considered too lightly armored to operate as a frontline battlemech. Opportunity cost spares no one, not even the rifleman. In spite of all of that, Callan had made a ton of money off of the battlemech and sought to double down with a 65-ton sister design. Digging through the specs, engineers needed to find a way to maximize the use of 5 additional tons and hit upon many of the challenges faced by the riflemen as they could. Eventually, by 2774, the Jagermech was deemed ready for the big show.
But don't expect to have a good time, because I am in a mood!
Volmer's mech lurked in the mech bay. A JM6 model, the Jagermech had a very distinctive profile. A domed cockpit capped the torso while the mech's shoulders rose above it. It had always seemed to Morgan that the mech was cringing. While its array of autocannons and lasers made analysts tout it as a good fire support mech, it couldn't deliver overwhelming destruction at range. Doing that was key to Morgan's conception of mech warfare, so the Jagermech was an inferior mech, implying that those who drove them were inferior mech warriors. In the hands of a skilled warrior, though, it can put up a bit of a fight. Not the Way the Smart Money Bets, by Michael A. Stackpole. Though Callan Industries became its own mega corporation during the Succession Wars, it actually started as a subsidiary of Earthworks Limited. The legal and bureaucratic framework of that connection became labyrinthian over time as the logistics lines for parts and production were split between the Free Worlds League and the Federated Suns. With the collapse of the Star League, the connection became untenable and Callan separated from Earthworks officially, though Callan did maintain offices in both realms, with the main offices on Talon in the Warrenke system in Davion territory. With so much distance and the Capellan Confederation between them, the two arms of Callan Industries operated largely independently from each other, though with a single CEO. The company differentiated its production between general arms, battle mechs, and armored vehicles, with most of its flagship designs stomping off the lines on Talon. This brings us back to our friend the Jagermech, which we should probably discuss for a bit considering the title of the video, I guess. Seeking to address at least a few of the issues from the riflemen, the JM6S Jagermech that stomped into existence in 2774 was undoubtedly a fresh take on the heavy fire support battlemech. Crafted from a Callan Type 12 chassis wrapped around a Magna 260 Fusion engine, the 64 km/h top speed was typical for other mechs in the weight class at the time. As the design team hammered out all the details with gyro and other component installation, it became clear that the 5 additional tons of mass over the rifleman wasn't going to be enough to address all of the identified shortcomings. In fact, in order to cram in the massive Milliorn autocannons sourced for the project, there would have to be a pretty notable concession. As much as it likely hurt to do it, the Jagermech would not just not be able to improve upon the rifleman's thin armor, it would actually have a full 1.5 tons less protection, with just 6 tons of Callan Royal Star standard plate. With just 96 points of armor, the JM6S had thinner armor than many 40 and 45-ton Succession War-era battlemechs. To justify this, the design team had to go all in with a weapons loadout. If you're going to build a glass cannon, it better be worth the risk of the Mechwarrior. With just 10 single heat sinks, the Jagermech was still devoted to avoiding the rifleman's heat issues through the installation of 2 Milliorn Model C AC-5 autocannons split between the arms, backed up by 2 more Milliorn AC-2s next to them in the same limbs. Each AC-5 had its own dedicated 1 ton of ammunition from which it could feed, and 2 AC-2s munched from the single ton of ammunition in the center torso. The installation of the autocannons dealt with both the heat issues as well as the lack of ammunition, but as we're going to learn, there's no such thing as a free lunch. The last additions to the mech were a pair of Magna Mark II medium lasers split between the side torsos. Their reliable damage at short range was important in the goal of keeping this mech functioning in the heat of battle. The end product was a battle mech that sacrificed the punch of the rifleman's large lasers in favor of a more consistent lower level of damage that could theoretically outlast its cousin in longer battles. Unfortunately, the trade-off included the armor decrease, which pushed back on the argument for longevity. The Jagermech fanboys, all 3 of them, will argue that the ability to alpha strike at close range without overheating is worth noting, and I can't refute that point. However, those alpha strikes are going to be doing up to 24 damage in comparison to the rifleman's 36. For a good amount of time, the Jagermech would be able to do more damage, but time is not the Jagermech's friend when you have ammunition on each side of the mech and only 13 points of armor protecting it. To further bolster the Jagermech's marketability, the sales team played up the Garrett T11A and D2J comlink and targeting and tracking system, which gave the mech an edge when tracking airborne targets. Combined with the mech's larger ammunition reserves, the Jagermech did have an advantage over the rifleman for that niche role. 2 days ago, Coalition forces under General Lee came under intense fire as they attempted landings in and around Sydney, Sutherland, Campbelltown, and Wollongong. Almost half of the task force crashed, scattering troops and ships across nearly 100 kilometers of territory west of the Wild Dog Mountains. Adding to their woes, the Word of Blake's 7th Division materialized from hidden fortifications within the Genelin Cave system. They caught the 8th Davion regulars as they struggled to regroup near the town of Hartley, obliterating them. Those lucky few who survived the carnage were executed in cold blood by Blakist hit squads. Overhead, a flight of Blakist aerospace fighters screamed past, spitting flames at a nearby MASH unit. A one-armed Jagermech, wearing more patch primer than paint, steps out from under camouflage-aged netting and sprays rounds from its remaining arm at the retreating craft. Hot shell casings clang to the ground in droves. The screams of the wounded fill the air. Tanaka barely flinches. Jhad Hotspots, Terra. Defying all logic, it seems that the Jagermech saw plenty of interest from buyers across the inner sphere. The first to add the JM6S to their ranks were the armed forces of the Federated Suns, who of course were keen on the heavy mech sporting autocannons. Questions about the fragile new heavy mech were hand-waved by Callan's representatives, who stated that it was intended for a second-line fire support role, and if it was taking fire, you were using it wrong. Due to the proximity of production, most of the JM6Ss ended up in the hands of the Davions, but gradually they were spotted elsewhere. The Capellans picked up their share as salvage, and so did the Draconis Combine, but it was reported that the DCMS weren't very fond of the mech. I suspect it had something to do with their tendency toward dueling, which is not something you typically want to do in a Jagermech. Within the AFFS, the Davions tended to build their lances with combinations of Jagermechs and their existing stocks of riflemen. This mixture allowed each design to keep an eye on the other, and this proved successful for those early centuries. It's still wild to me that we talk about these weapon systems as viable across hundreds of years, in contrast to the real world where technology moves so quickly. What was the latest and greatest in battlefield technology 200 years ago would be near worthless on today's battlefields, but I digress. In April of 2993, during a raid by the Capellans on Demeter, a unit of Jagermechs and riflemen were cut off from logistics lines for weeks. With every shot counting, the Davion forces had to survive for long enough to break through to an ammunition depot. Reports suggest that they were able to do so only because of the larger stocks carried by the Jagermechs. I'm sure the riflemen's large lasers might disagree with that assessment, but they are inanimate and don't get a say. Though it might be difficult to believe, quite a few mech warriors earned distinction with the Jagermech. Perhaps it had something to do with the sort of person who'd be willing to take on such a challenging piece of machinery. One mech warrior named Diana Chung earned distinction first as a technician in the Davion Guards and later as a mech warrior. She proved to be quite resilient on the battlefield in her well-aged Jagermech, which she poured countless hours into maintaining and tweaking to maximize performance. Good on ya. As much as I'd love to stick to the positives for our friend the Jagermech, its flaws combined with poor tactical decisions did sometimes result in calamity. During the War of Tang, which took place between February and May of 2890, the planet Tang within the Capellan Confederation found itself within the crosshairs of a group of pirates who were operating in the Gartal Hills outside the planet's capital city. The Capellan Hussars had a company of defenders nearby which sent a lance of JM6 Jagermechs to defend a narrow valley while the rest of the company drove the pirates into a killbox where the Jagermech's autocannons could theoretically rain down fire. Unfortunately, the plan fell apart when the pirates pushed quickly through the trap and into the lance of Jagermechs, which lacked the ability to defend themselves at short range. Their armor was blistered and fractured, and 3 of the 4 Jagermechs were savaged before the pirates made their escape from the valley. The incident was a valuable lesson for those who might deploy the Jagermech into action, but we don't learn lessons around here, so let's just move on. A terrible rippling concussion shook the Say, and then a third mech pushed out of the trees. A brawler, a Jagermech. "Fall back," Wallace shrieked. "For God's sake, fall back!"
No, Doctor,
Janice snapped.
if we kill their recovery team, they're done. Hit the blizzard and this can all be over.
But Wallace was shaking his head, his eyes glued to the monster striding out of the jungle. The Jagermech's cockpit sat below its massive shoulders, making it look like a Neanderthal. Its broad feet carried it across the sand. Blue Waters, Counterattack Battle Corps Anthology by Stephen Mohan, Jr. Attempts to tweak the Jagermech's design included a drastic shift away from the autocannons as the primary damage dealers. The JM6A variant was produced for the Davions just 4 years after the mech's debut and featured a pair of LRM-15s split between the arms in place of the original AC-5 autocannons. Each launcher fed from its own dedicated ton of ammunition in the side torsos. The rest of the loadout was the same, except 2 tons of mass were dedicated to additional armor, bulking up the JM6A considerably. The 8 tons of protection provided the levels expected of other mechs in the 55 to 65 ton category, though still on the lighter end. For comparison, the Quick Draw 4G also carried 8 tons of armor, and the 55-ton Dervish carried 7.5. The JM6A Jagermech improved upon its role as a fire support mech at the cost of some flexibility due to the LRM's minimum range and having just 8 volleys per launcher. Defenders of the A variant were quick to point out that the upgraded armor was needed, and the LRM-15s provided front-loaded damage over the AC-5s, even if that damage was scattered. If given the 2 options, I'd personally take the JM6A in almost all situations. The missiles enveloped Amos's Orion in a ball of orange and crimson flames, and it crashed near her. The vibration of its impact shook her in her seat, and then she heard the warning signal of the Jagermech's weapons locking onto her. The autocannon rounds struck her battered mech everywhere at once. The quick draw reeled backward under the impact, almost losing its footing. Warning lights flared, indicating lost weapons and internal damage. The quick draw was dying all around her, and Hawk knew it. She fired what she had left, a barrage of lasers and short-range missiles that miraculously found their mark on the Jagermech, stopping its charge forward like a stone wall. By Blood Betrayed, by Blaine Lee Pardoe. Throughout the Succession Wars, the Jagermech became a staple of the armed forces of the Federated Suns, though almost exclusively in a support and second-line role. Surprisingly, there wouldn't be another official variant for the BattleMech for 271 years, which brings up all sorts of questions like who in the hell, and in the more general, why, Kerensky, why? Through time, commerce, salvage, and occasionally a mech falling off the back of the truck, the Jagermech would be spotted in other house militaries, merc units, and even the occasional pirate band, though it's difficult to imagine a good use case for a relatively slow and weak pirate battlemech. Maybe it can team up with a pirate and an urban mech. There were plenty of Jagermechs to go around, as in addition to the Talon production lines, Callan negotiated a licensing agreement with Independence Weaponry to produce the mech in the Quentin factories. This ended up being a folly as the world was lost to the Draconis Combine in the War of 3039. Though unpopular, the DCMS was in dire need of new battlemechs to replace those lost in the war, so the Jagermech production line was continued. Woe to the DCMS Mechwarriors who learned they would be receiving a brand new Jagermech for their first assignment or replacement of a fallen catapult. Often teamed up with riflemen, dervishes, and other fire support mechs, the Jagermech could boast of at least holding its own and proving its worth. If only we could say that about ourselves all the time. It's worth noting that the AFFS wasn't as stringent about lance composition as some of the other house militaries, so it wasn't unheard of to see the Jagermech in a lance with a Marauder and other frontline heavies. It was more important to unit commanders that a lance's 4 mech warriors work well together and demonstrate good unit cohesion rather than following the tactical letter of the law. With almost 3 centuries under its belt, by the 3030s and 3040s it was increasingly clear that the Jagermech, along with many other battlemechs, needed a serious revamp to stay in the fight. In 3049, Callan introduced the production of the re-envisioned Jagermech, designated the JM6DD, and unlike some Helm Memory Core refits, this was an extensive redesign. Starting from the inside and burrowing out like your friendly neighborhood Krenna, the 260 fusion engine was swapped out for a brand new Callan Type 12 extra light fusion engine. This shaved off 6.5 tons of mass at the cost of a larger internal profile. The structure remained standard, but the armor was upgraded to 6.5 tons of Callan Unity Weave ferrofibrous armor, which provided 116 points of protection, which was about a 17% increase over the previous version. With the 10 standard heat sinks left where they were, only the weapons loadout needed to be sorted out by the Callan designers. Clearly, they wanted to maintain the build profile from the original Jagermech, but with updated versions of each weapon system where possible. The mass saved from the XL engine made it possible to yank the standard AC-5s from the original Jagermech and replace them with a pair of General Motors Nova 5 Ultra autocannons. This doubled the potential damage from the mech's primary weapons at the cost of increased ammunition consumption and the potential for somewhat inconvenient jamming. Each autocannon's single ton of ammunition was stored in the adjacent side torso, which was given case to protect the pilot and mech from catastrophic ammunition explosions. The Mydron Model D AC-2 autocannons were left where they were alongside their larger peers in the arms, but the single ton of ammunition was moved from the center torso to the right torso to benefit from case. Finally, the classic workhorse medium lasers in the side torsos were swapped out for brand new Sutel Precision Line medium pulse lasers, which made closing on the Jagermech a much more dangerous proposition for light battlemechs. The new Jagermechs began to stomp off the assembly lines just in time for the arrival of the clans, who probably laughed their butts off when fire support mechs like the Jagermech DD cratered after just a few hits from their long-range weaponry. Sad but true. Direct contact was inevitable among the Federated Commonwealth units, which had been deliberately seeded with battlemechs from both sides of the Steiner-Davion alliance. After Jamie Wolfe's decision to betray the clans and hand over a wealth of intelligence to the House Lords and Comstar in January of 3051, one of the resulting technological agreements between the Davions and the Draconis Combine included sharing the plans for the Jagermech DD so that it could be produced to bolster the DCMS in the fight against the Smoke Jaguars and Ghost Bears. I bet Hiro Corrido was just over the moon. Titan panicked. He cut loose with everything he had, spiking his heat. As strategies went, it was a good one. Any combination of hits would be devastating and could put the Jagermech down. That required him to hit, however, and panic did little to steady his hands on the joysticks. The autocannon and both lasers missed, bracketing the smaller mech and devastating the cinderblock ruins behind him. SRMs did hit, shattering armor on the Jagermech's left arm and leg. Not the Way the Smart Money Bets, by Michael A. Stackpole. Following the introduction of the JM6DD, new variants for the Jagermech would arrive much more frequently. In 3054, likely as a result of extensive contact with clan forces, the JM6DG was produced in the first radical departure from previous molds. The DG was structurally identical to the DD except for the weapons loadout, which stripped out all 4 autocannons and the pulse lasers and replaced them with a pair of Gauss rifles split between the arms and a pair of standard medium lasers set into the center torso. Each rifle was given 3 tons of dedicated ammunition stored in the side torsos. The case from the DD remained in the side torsos, which could still be useful should those Gauss rifles suffer a critical hit. I'm rather fond of the Jagermech DG as it's far more formidable as a long-range opponent. The damage output is high and concentrated, and with plenty of ammunition, the DG can linger on the battlefield longer than most other ammo-dependent battlemechs. It's still a glass cannon, but now it's a pretty powerful cannon that could put points on the board. We're going to skip over it basically, but there is a later sub-variant of the DG designated the DGR, which upgraded the heatsinks to double strength and swapped out the standard medium lasers for the ER versions. Good stuff. In 3057, the JM7D Jagermech demonstrated a return to a more familiar form, but with several notable structural and weapons changes. The 7D once again relied upon an extra light fusion engine to buy mass for use elsewhere. In this case, the mech finally saw the upgrade to double heatsinks with 13 installed into the battlemech. Additionally, the days of weak armor coverage were over as 11 tons of ferrofibrous plate provided 197 points of protection. That's more than twice as much armor as the original Jagermech. The 7D's weapons loadout is a nod to the original with the installation of 2 Ultra AC5 autocannons into the arms, but in this case they were bolstered by 2 ER large lasers as well. Now we know what those double heatsinks were for. The range profiles for the 2 weapons are nearly identical, and for the first time the Jagermech could persist as a battlefield threat far from logistics lines. With just 1 ton of case-protected ammunition for each UAC-5, the weapons really do need to become more support than primary damage dealers. Finally, at close range, 2 center torso-mounted medium pulse lasers could melt some faces. The 3060s would feature several new variants, including the JM7F, which was a demonstration of the new rotary autocannon technology. Structurally, it was the same as the previous JM7 series Jagermechs with the XL engine, 12 double heatsinks, and 11 tons of ferrofibrous armor. This time, there was no doubt about the primary weapons, as the 2 rotary AC5 autocannons could send a lot of ordnance downfield. Thankfully, they were fed by 4 tons of case-protected ammunition stored in the left torso. 2 medium pulse lasers in the center torso provided their accurate fire, and all 4 weapons were aided by a right torso-mounted targeting computer. Finally, a Guardian ECM suite was installed into the left torso, making this our first Operation Sneaky Sneak Jagermech of the day. As usual with the rotary AC5s, if you love them, you're probably going to enjoy the JM7F. If you're lukewarm or not a fan, that could poison the well. Regardless, the prospect of just unleashing the fury on some hapless target in the right moment and evaporating its armor under a hail of depleted uranium munitions is a tempting one. Our next variant arrived in 3064, and it's going to take us way out into the periphery where the Marian hegemony decided to get in on the fun. For whatever reason, the periphery folks really love rocket launchers, so I guess we're doing this. The JM6H reflected a hybrid of new and old as the mech's original standard engine returned, yet it still carried 10 double heatsinks and 10 tons of ferrofibrous armor. The 6H's primary weapon consisted of 2 standard large lasers and a pair of LB2X autocannons split between the arms. The autocannons fed from a single ton of ammunition stored in the left torso. If things got really hairy, the 6 Rocket Launcher 15 racks split between the side torsos offered the possibility of doing catastrophic damage to a single target if the moment was right. Under normal use, heat wasn't an issue for the mech, but once you start letting those rockets fly, you better let Kerensky take the wheel and hope it all works out. As usual, the periphery designs are quirky and tend to make sense in their own little universe. Those Marians are so wacky, they're always up to something. Garner's Phoenix Hawk darted in, trying to attract the Jaeger's attention. It was an idiotically imbalanced struggle, the 45-ton medium mech engaging a monster 20 tons heavier and with far superior weapons. The Jaeger mech broke off its murderous onslaught against Kalmar and turned to deal with this stinging gadfly. Autocannon rounds struck Garner's battlemech in its left shoulder and arm, smashing one of her medium lasers, as well as one of her anti-infantry machine guns. Garner kicked off into the sky, her pitband jump jets raising an immense swirl of dust behind her. The Jagermech, designed to engage airborne targets, pivoted and elevated, tracking her with merciless precision, its quad of autocannons hammering relentlessly against Marta Garner's Hawk. A Rock in a Hard Place by William H. Keith. The 3068 JM7G Jagermech took another stab at the autocannon build using the new standard 7 series hardware. The only structural note was the use of 13 double heatsinks, which were needed to cover for the heat generated by the mech's 2 side torso-mounted ER medium lasers. The stars of the show, sort of, were the G's twin rotary AC2 autocannons, which were paired with 2 LB2X autocannons in the arms. This thing has strong death by 1,000 small cuts vibes. Each of the 4 autocannons had its own dedicated ton of ammunition, so there's very little chance that the ammo bins will go dry during a typical engagement. Likely used as an anti-air platform, the JM7G would struggle against land-based opponents of most sizes. Plus, playing this thing on the tabletop would be a nightmare of dice rolling. Ugh. In 3070, there was yet another attempt to try to make the autocannon thing work with a piece of new tech. The JM6DDA was a sub-variant of the original Double D, which was structurally the same except for some tweaks in the weapons loadout. The classic AC5 autocannons made their return, but with an extra third ton of ammunition stashed into the left torso. Along with the AC5s, 2 light AC2s were split between the arms and each fed from their own single ton of ammo in the case-protected left torso. For those counting at home, that's 4 tons of autocannon ammunition in the left torso. Praise Kerensky for case. 2 standard medium lasers in the center torso provided some modest short-range fire, which is nice. Finally, a right torso-mounted targeting computer improved the accuracy of the whole weapon set. Overall, the JM6DDA is a pretty useful machine. The light AC2s and the AC5s share a range profile, and the plentiful ammunition will very likely outlast the rest of the mech in a fight. I like it, it's okay. Let's give this one a rating, Minifrog. What do you think of the Jagermech? He gives it 3 chocolate chip cookies and this water-warped Pokemon card, out of 5. Now, if you've lasted this long, you deserve a little treat, so our next to last official variant for the Jagermech is a spicy one. In 3075, the experimental JM7 C3BS variant hit the scene with several new toys with which to play. The mech was very similar to the previous 7 series Jagermechs with the standard structure, XL engine, and 13 double heatsinks. Oh, and the 11 tons of ferrofibrous armor. Nothing shocking so far. However, when we get to the weapons, things start to get interesting. Starting with the longest range and working our way in, 4 light AC2 autocannons were split between the arms, which fed from 2 tons of case-protected ammunition in each side torso. Don't worry, because that's still 22 and 23 shots per autocannon before the bins run dry. At just 3 hexes difference in max range, the mech's 2 snub-nosed particle projection cannons came into play with their advantageous range profile. Next up, starting at 12 hexes, a singleton ER medium laser in the center torso could polish off weakened foes. The last addition to the mech was a C3 boosted slave computer to participate in the network. And since you're all paying very close attention, the C3BS looks much more like a mid-range brawler than a fire support battlemech. While the 4 light AC2s could provide very modest coverage at distance, this is definitely a role shift for the battlemech. I'm okay with this just to introduce a little bit more variety into the mix. Meta shoved her controls forward, and the big mech responded instantly, striding out of the narrow pass at nearly 50 kilometers per hour. A Lancer's Jagermech seemed to spot her. Its barrel-shaped torso twisted as the pilot brought the long, stiff arms with their piggybacked autocannons up to point at her mech. The Barbarian fired the light Class 2 weapons, filling the air with their alto bark. He didn't fire the heavier Class 5 ultra weapons that comprised the Jagermech's main armament, even though she was well within their 600-meter maximum range. The lightweight slugs spent their impotent fury on the thick armor covering her mech's body and left arm. Shadow of War, Twilight of the Clans Volume 6, by Thomas S. Gressman. By the dawn of the IlClan era, the Jagermech, even in its updated forms, was looking a little rough around the edges. Callan Weapon Industries on Wernke had some options in tackling an updated design, including the Jagermech III platform, which we skipped right over because I'm bad at managing my time. We'll get to it, I promise. The choice was made to work off of the JM7 series as a base, as it was already on the receiving end of multiple upgrades over the past century. The new variant, designated the JM7DD, stomped off the assembly lines in 3146 just in time to feed into the AFFS as they struggled to kick the Draconis Combine out of Davion territory. The 7DD featured not just an endo-composite structure, but also an extra light fusion engine and an extra light gyro. We're going all in here. 11 double heat sinks promised to keep the mech running cool, and once again 11 tons of ferrofibrous armor kept the mech in an adequate number of armor points. If you're worried about open critical hit locations, don't sweat it because the 7DD doesn't have any. The remaining open spots were taken up by a rather nasty collection of weaponry. A pair of clan spec Ultra AC-10 autocannons and light AC-5 autocannons were split between the arms, all feeding from ammunition bins in a case to protected side torsos. 2 tons of each UAC-10 and 1 ton apiece for the light AC-5s. Finally, 2 ER medium lasers were set into the side torsos, polishing off the build. The presence of the clan spec UAC-10s will dominate the discussion as they, for the first time, make the Jagermech extremely dangerous, at least for a short amount of time. 20 shots per autocannon could go quite quickly if the Mechwarrior is bold enough to be double firing consistently. The light AC-5s are okay mid-range weapons, able to do their 5 damage out to 15 hexes, which reinforces the idea that this Jagermech is much more of a plodding skirmisher rather than a fire support battlemech. The variant's biggest issues are its speed and the fact that once you start taking internal damage, things are going to go downhill very quickly. While the Case 2 is essential and does contribute, there are just a ton of gyro and engine criticals to hit in order to make this build happen. Add in the fragile endo-composite frame, and the 7DD is the very definition of a glass cannon. Overall, it's quite the battlemech. I just look at the 15.1 million C-bill price in Megamech and wonder what you could get if all this effort wasn't expended trying to cram a square peg into a round hole. Now, I like a sunk cost fallacy as much as the next frog, but at some point we're going to have to move on. Now, before we hop along to the MF config, we do need to take a quick rewind back to the dark days of the 3050s, where all heck was breaking loose within the Federated Commonwealth. In one of the odder initiatives to keep morale up and reinforce the AFFS, Victor Steiner Davion pushed Callan to develop an updated version of the Jagermech and other mainstay designs of the Succession Wars AFFC. The end result of the project was considerably different than the 6 or 7 series Jaegers, and thus became a third branching evolution of the design. The Jagermech III still carried the JM6 designation, but shared little in look or substance. Constructed from Callan Type 4 endosteel around a 325 Vox extra light fusion engine, the Jagermech III was considerably faster than its cousins of the same name. The D3 carried 12 double heat sinks and could almost boast about its 9.5 tons of ferrofibrous armor. For weaponry, the primary weapons were surprisingly 2 Johnston Particannon particle projection cannons split between the arms. They were backed up, sort of, by 2 Mydron Model D Ultra AC-2 autocannons that fed from a single ton of ammunition in the right torso. Finally, 2 standard medium lasers were split between the side torsos. The main draw for the Jagermech D3 had to be its speed because it almost seems like the weapons were an afterthought. Besides the UAC-2s, the loadout has a very Succession Wars feel to it, set into a mech with endosteel and an XL engine. It's all very odd. Production was greenlit quickly, and by 3058 the Jagermech III was being shipped out to units in the Chaos March. There was plenty of bluster and confetti thrown about as both the Jagermech III and Enforcer III were touted as examples of a rejuvenated Federated Commonwealth. If that had any long-lasting impact, it's up to the historians to argue it out. There was one official alt variant for the Jagermech III designated the JM6D4, which hit the scene in 3073. It was significantly different structurally with 16 double heat sinks and 12.5 tons of light ferrofibrous armor. The 580 movement profile was retained from the D3 along with its 2 standard PPCs in the arms. 2 additional standard medium lasers were added to the center torso, and the UAC-2s were yanked in favor of a pair of light PPCs in the arms. This means there is actually an official all-energy weapon build Jagermech out there. Try not to stare, it's rude. The D4 isn't heat neutral in an alpha strike, but it's not usually going to be an issue until you're firing off those medium lasers at short range. The PPCs and light PPCs share a ranged profile, so the Jagermech D4 can run and gun in the mid-range without excess heat. When the time is right, you can just start the light show since there's no ammunition to cook off anyway. Have fun out there. Now, I know we've covered quite a few variants today, but I did want to take a crack at creating my own totally non-canon and unofficial variant. In an attempt to turn the mech into a formidable foe, I took the JM7 series chassis and ripped it apart. Once all the bits and pieces were scattered across the mech bay, I decided maybe I should have read the instruction manual first. Or maybe taken some pictures of what all these cables looked like before I yanked them out. Oh well. The JM7 MF Jagermech has a standard structure around a typical 260XL engine. 12 tons of ferrofibrous armor provided fair protection, and we needed 14 double heat sinks for reasons. The last bit of structural tweaking was the addition of 2 actuator enhancement systems into the arms to provide a little added accuracy to the weapons contained therein. I know frequent watchers of the channel will be shocked to learn that I added 2 plasma rifles to the mech, giving each arm exactly what every growing mech warrior needs. Each rifle has 2 tons of ammunition, which is stored in the side torsos to provide some inert padding for the eventual side torso critical hits. As it was risking becoming another brawler build, the MF needed another weapon with some range to it. Since we're already playing with Liao gear, I figured it wasn't too much of a leap to add a Clan large pulse laser to the right torso. Call it salvage from the Wolf Empire mechs. Finally, an inner sphere spec medium pulse laser in the left arm added a little bit of super accurate short-range punch. The last added item was an anti-missile system in the center torso fed by 1 ton of ammunition. While I was tempted to just add more armor instead, I think this more closely fits the Jagermech's original glass cannon aesthetic. The end result is a battle mech that can hit quite hard at all ranges, but thrives in the mid-range, where the large pulse laser and plasma rifles can pick apart opponents 10 damage at a time. The 1d6 heat effect per rifle could also throw into question the ability of the target to return fire and chew through the MF's modest protection. The 14 double heat sinks are adequate for general use, though if the medium pulse laser comes into play, it might be necessary to rein it in with one of the plasma rifles. I'm curious to know what you think about it. Feel free to call it dumb in the comments section if you like. Don't worry, I don't have normal human emotions, just the smoking husk full of Halloween candy wrappers. If you'd like to give the variant a go, I've included a PDF record sheet for it in the video notes below. Enjoy. Up ahead, the defile opened up into a narrow valley, wide enough for a mech to pass by the convoy on the left. Kittrick was in the lead, and Castor watched the Randy's Mechwarrior step his squat Jagermech past an opening in the right wall. The big machine was ugly, with its rounded cockpit set well below its powerful shoulders. It stalked the world on clumsy-looking spade feet, but it was a dangerous mech, even with an idiot for a pilot. Especially with an idiot for a pilot. Red Kopesh by Stephen Mohan, Jr. So why do we love the Jagermech? This is a tough one because it's really hard to love a mech that steps outside of the generalist umbrella just to fail consistently at its purpose. The original is a fire support battle mech that isn't very good at offering fire support and is a glass cannon where the makers forgot to make it a cannon. So really it's just glass. Unfortunate. A surface-level understanding would demand that we just declare the Jagermech a bad mech and move on. But I don't think it's that simple. The concept is a sound one. Many battle mechs push the opportunity cost to an extreme and yet end up quite functional and deadly. In this case, it's not the mech, but the weaponry that's the issue. I know the old line is that the poor carpenter blames his tools, but in this case, if your framing hammer weighed 25 pounds when it should weigh 25 ounces, your work would be impacted. The AC2s and AC5s are way too heavy for the damage they generate, and the issue is amplified on the Jagermech when you add 4 of them. Investing 31 tons into weapons that collectively do 14 damage is not a great plan, no matter how you try to sort it. That's why, as time passes, the more successful Jagermechs tended to either abandon those weapons entirely or adopt the slightly more efficient versions of them. While the Jagermech continues to have a future in the BattleTech timeline, it represents a group of battlemechs that are often derided but are still needed to create a rich tapestry. Not every mech has to be min-maxed into oblivion, and we're all better off if most aren't. But I'm curious what you think. Do you think there's one variant that shows the Jagermech in its peak form? Let me know in the comments and we'll keep the discussion going. Thanks as always for coming out today. If you think the video deserves it and you want to show your support, the easiest way to do that is to hit that like button, subscribe, and even leave a comment. All of those things make the YouTube algorithm very happy. If you want to go one step further, direct support through Ko-fi or YouTube channel memberships are a great way to help ensure the nonsense keeps flowing. Just a couple of bucks a month makes a big difference. I can't do this without you, and I appreciate it. If you would like to join the nonsense on the MechFrog Discord channel, we'd love to see you. I've included a link to the server in the video notes. It's the best way to find out what's coming next week, talk to BattleTech fans, share your pictures for videos, and otherwise hang out with some pretty awesome people. With that, I'll say have a great week, take care, and please go out and make the world a slightly better place today and tomorrow.